Hello everyone, and thanks for bearing with us, and sorry for being a little bit late. My fault, Zoom ate itself. Thank you all so much for coming. Just to let you know briefly before we start, we are recording this, and that's just so that we can send this out to you tomorrow in case anyone's missed it or you want to watch again. We've put you all on mute as well, just so that there's not loads of people talking over each other, so don't panic, that's fine. And I'm going to pass over to you now, Eleanor.
Oh, hello. The best thing about this is being able to see you all in your houses. It's really fun. Hi, I'm Eleanor. Welcome to our Women in Journalism kind of literary book chat. We're going to kick off with Christina Lamb, who has written this amazing book called Our Bodies, Their Battlefields, and is also a old and much beloved colleague of mine. Not that we're that old, Christina. We're in our prime. But we're going to talk a bit. Christina Lamb, as I'm sure many of you know, I would say probably one of the very, very top foreign correspondents in the UK, has reported from all over the world, particularly well known for her amazing recent stuff around women. And before that, she reported from Afghanistan with the Taliban. She's got 4 amazing stories, and anyone can possibly get through in the time that we've got. And also, of course, all the other kind of massive crises around the world. She went to Benazir Bhutto's wedding. She's done incredible stuff recently with refugees in Greece and coming up through Europe. And I think to start a bit, I mean, there are 2 very obvious things we should be talking about today. One, of course, is the and what's happening to journalists in America. But also, maybe we should start with what it's like to be a foreign correspondent on lockdown.
Thanks, Eleanor. It's great talking to you. Well, it's not a great time to be a foreign correspondent, it has to be said, because obviously we can't travel, which is fairly fundamental to the job. So we're having to find new ways to either cover things from afar, which wonders of technology, as we're using now, or, but I don't really like the reporting because there's nothing like actually being in a place, or doing something different. So actually, for the first time in my career, really, I'm reporting on my own country and what's happening here during coronavirus. And which has been very interesting because it's not something I've ever really done. And of course, this is the biggest story that basically any of us have lived through.
And tell me, how do you think a foreign correspondent's kind of view of their own country is different from your kind of average hack that you'd send out? I mean, what do you think you bring to it, having been to all those war zones and interviewed all those people and been in all those places for all those years, that somebody who's doing that every day might not bring to the job?
I mean, I would hate to say that foreign correspondents sort of are better at covering our own country than people who've been doing it for years. So I don't think that. I just think that maybe we look at things differently. And, you know, to me, actually, I've spent as much of my lifetime, or my working life abroad, as I have here. So it is kind of a foreign country to me. And I've been concerned that the coverage is not very much focused on the human side of the story. And so every day we have these huge numbers. I know it's gone down now, but you know, at one point 700 deaths, 800 deaths. This is like, you know, 10 times the number of people that died in Grenfell or in any of the terrorist attacks we've had. And yet we didn't really know anything about any of the people. It just became numbers and statistics. And I do feel that the reporting has focused a lot on that, you know, of course, and on the policy. And of course, it's important to look at, you know, what the government has done right and wrong and when things have been done. But I do think that this is fundamentally a human story. Thousands of people are losing their lives. We're living through a plague, and we need to convey that story.
Yeah, so perhaps not enough really of the kind of drama that's going on. I mean, I know as a kind of participant in lockdown, there's that very weird sense of life being incredibly different, but also everything kind of seeming the same, but not. So there's that weird juxtaposition. And you were talking about risk. I mean, as a foreign correspondent, you've been in some incredibly hairy situations, and we'll talk a bit about some of those later. But how is the risk? We were talking today about Lindsay Hilson, for instance, going off to Brazil. She's there now reporting on the coronavirus, which is incredibly dangerous given the infection rates in Brazil, and also you've got to get there and all that kind of thing. How are those risks different from the kind of ones that you take in a war?
It is different because my instinct was to, go to places when they started and, go to the worst hit places, go to the hospitals that were seeing the most number of deaths. But the risk is different to the risk in a war, because there the risk is just to you. Here, if you get infected of coronavirus, then you are putting your family, anyone that you come into contact with, at risk too, and they could die. So, that's very scary.
And I'm noticing, actually, I mean, I've got lots of questions to ask you, but there's a good question from Jane Wyatt on the chat saying, how do you cope with the trauma of war and disaster reporting? So how do you factor in that constant risk in your life?
Well, actually, I mean, that is a good kind of parallel to the situation we're in now. I've always wondered, when I am in war situations and conflict, what it would be like to suddenly find yourself overnight in that situation. What is it like to be living in Aleppo and suddenly under siege from Assad's forces? I've always been astonished at the resilience of the people that I meet in these places. And I think we kind of saw that here with coronavirus. I mean, literally overnight, suddenly we were living a completely different life, and we were fearful too. Maybe now that fear seems to have gone, but at the beginning, you didn't know if you went out and bought some milk at the supermarket whether you might get infected. And so, overnight, suddenly we were living this really completely different existence, and where we were trying to avoid all human contact. And yet, for the most part, people coped surprisingly well. I think if people had been told a few months earlier this was going to happen to them, they would have imagined all sorts of terrible things would ensue, and that it would be very difficult for us. And I'm not saying that this is easy, but I'm just saying that, the kind of things we've seen, the resilience people have shown, some of the amazing community spirit I just see on my own street. I didn't really know my neighbours. Now I don't see them particularly because of the situation, but we exchange WhatsApps. We have had street parties, we've had street wine tasting, and and now I know lots more about them, and that's great. And everyone's been trying to help each other and offer, I don't know if they've got spare carrots or milk or bread, and that's all been really nice. So that, I feel that kind of indicates what I've always said about war zones, that in these darkest places you see the sort of brightest lights, and I think we have seen that. But it's not, I mean, I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about it. We also, seeing some very bad things, the rise in domestic violence and things like that.
What do you think? I mean, we'll come back to some of the more general issues, but I think people are really interested in what it's like to do a job where you risk your life by kind of going to work or getting on that plane over and over again. And I mean, you and I have talked about this a lot over the years. And I remember a piece that you wrote for me probably 15 years ago now, when I was on the news review, about Kalashnikovs and cupcakes. And of course, one of the real fascinations about you has also always been that you're a mum, and you go off and you do this while being a mother. Do you want to talk a bit about that and how you've managed it?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's what I've always done. So I started doing it as a young journalist, and so I don't really know anything else in my family only know me doing that. So it's hard for me to compare. But obviously, when I became a mother, it makes difference, because then you have somebody that you're responsible for, and you don't want to take the same risks. But in terms of, I mean, first of all, I don't believe anyone who says they don't get scared in these situations. It is scary to be in places where people are trying to kill you and shooting, but you do tend to get caught up with the story. I mean, once the the scariest bit is often either after something terrible has happened or before you get on the plane, when you're kind of thinking about it. But actually, once I'm on the plane, I'm then just thinking about the story and what I'm going to cover. And then when you get there, you're kind of caught up. And I think it's also important to remember that even if you go to a war zone, there's not everything is fighting, you know, like Syria, for example. Through it all, there were a lot of people still going to work, getting married, having children, trying to keep a normal life. And actually that fascinates me much more than the actual fighting side of it.
And as a woman going to these places, do you think that are there more women than when you started out?
Yeah, I mean, when I started, often I was the only woman in a place. And actually, I didn't really think about it. I only became more conscious of that later. It was just what I was used to. But now there's lots, particularly in the Middle East, there's a lot of very young, feisty female reporters, which is great. I think TV is better than newspapers, and I think American papers are much better than British papers. We still have some way to go, but it has changed a lot, and I think that's really good.
What about the editors that you've worked for? So you and I always had a conversation about this. So how many female foreign editors have you worked for, and how long have you been doing it? How long have you been a foreign correspondent?
I've been a foreign correspondent 33 years, wow, and I have never had a female foreign editor. Until very recently, I'd never had a female editor. The editor of Sunday Times, we got a new female editor at the end of January, Emma. And I've never had, well, the Sunday Times is kind of weird situation because the head of news is male, but we have a female news editor. So, but I mean, it pretty much has always seemed to me that the person that I was talking to about stories or deciding whether I could go to somewhere or what they thought of the story was always a man, except when I was working with you on magazine stories, and that made a huge difference, because I think women have very different views of what make an interesting story than men do. And
actually that's quite an interesting segue into your latest book. Giving it another plug, Our Bodies, Their Battlefields. I would say, I'd give it a tiny health warning to say that if you're feeling slightly depressed about COVID, you might want to dip into it sparingly. But then again, it might actually make you realise how lucky you are that you're not in one of these places. But a lot of, I think I'm right in saying that a lot of the stories that make up this book are stories that you and I have worked on kind of together. I mean, well, you've gone and done the reporting, but that came out of kind of some shared interests. And I'm interested in, so do you want to talk a bit about the book and the stories in there, and then let's talk a bit about some of their genesis?
Yeah, so I wrote this book, I mean, I always felt as a female reporter in conflict areas that the female side of the story was very little told, even by female correspondents, that women were sort of written out of history. And, you know, if you go back to sort of history books that we read at school about the Second World War and things, women are very absent in a lot of these stories. And so it wasn't a conscious thing for me, but I think being a woman, I always was much more interested in what the women were doing, and that was more fascinating, and always spoke to the women and tried to tell that side of the story. But there's also a dark side of the story, which is the brutality against women in war, and the widespread use of rape as a weapon of war. And I really became very upset about this, covering which was for you, the Yazidi women. And I'm sure everyone remembers, they were captured, lots of girls and young women, and taken sort of what were really slave markets, where they were separated into ugly and beautiful, and then ISIS fighters would come and choose which one they wanted and do what they wanted to them. And sometimes some of these girls were sold on, I met one girl who was sold on 12 times, as if they were cattle or goats. And the stories were just so awful and so sad. And so I was really shocked by that. And then all around the same time were the Chibok girls in Nigeria, who you might remember were captured from their school dormitory in the middle of the night by Boko Haram fighters and taken into the Sambisa forest to be their sort of bushwives, as they call them. And then when I went to look at that, I discovered that actually everybody got very excited about that because that was 219 girls. But in fact, there were tens of thousands of girls who were being abducted and kept. And it was incredibly sad because when they were released, sometimes the Nigerian military who rescued them would then rape them themselves. And then they were in these camps where their communities wouldn't take them back because they saw them as sullied and bringing shame to the community. So they were ostracized, and the only way that they could survive was to sleep with the camp officials to get food and anything that they needed. So these girls were being victimized over and over again. And then the following year, so this was all between about 2014, 2017, the Rohingya women in Burma who were attacked by Burmese military, tied to banana trees, gang raped, often in front of their children, and then fled into Bangladesh, which I covered too. And that was really shocking because of the scale of it. I mean, 700,000 people fled into Bangladesh, and more than half of them were women and children, and every single woman you met told you one of these stories. So I found it really shocking that this was happening in the 21st century at such scale. And I also couldn't really understand why, we were writing about it. People knew what was happening, and yet nothing happened. Nobody was prosecuted.
And do you think that that's, I mean, I suppose before people could say that they didn't know, because that was always the thing before around the Holocaust, wasn't it? That lots of people said, oh, well, we didn't know. And you've certainly borne witness to what's happened to lots of these women. But you're right that it isn't a story. When I came in as editor of the Sunday Times magazine, and we first discussed you going back to Chibok, because do you remember during the beginning of the Chibok crisis, Michelle Obama, everybody, all these celebs were jumping up and down with those placards saying, bring back our girls, and it all came out of the hashtag, which you write about brilliantly in the book. But then by the time you went back again, when was that? So like 2016?
It was 2 years later, yeah.
Yeah, and by then it was completely off the front pages. Everybody had forgotten about them. But there were 350 girls that we knew about who'd gone from Chibok, and as you say, tens of thousands more. And yet they totally kind of gone off the news agenda. And that was one of the things that I always found kind of surprising. I remember when I suggested that maybe we were going to go back and find out what happened to the Chibok girls, meeting some resistance. People kind of going, well, why are you interested in that? Do you think that that's a common view?
Yes, I think we're very bad generally at following up stories. I mean, now it's 6 years since the Chibok girls were abducted, and more than 100 is still missing. But nobody really covers anything about it, and I've always hated that. I always feel very concerned that we shouldn't just go somewhere and make a big thing and then ignore it afterwards. So
and in fact the fact that the Chibok girls had all that massive international publicity was not necessarily a good thing, was it?
No, absolutely not. You're right. I mean, it made them as into something very precious for Boko Haram, and they felt, I mean, somebody described to me it was their crown jewels, that they knew it was a huge international issue, so they weren't just going to give them up. They wanted something big in return. And yeah, I believe very strongly that it's made it a lot harder to get. And the ones that have been released, there was 2 groups that were released about 18 months ago, that was quite a lot of money was paid and prisoners swapped. So yeah, sometimes, and that's hard, I think, sometimes our attempts to focus on things and bring to light injustice might inadvertently make things harder.
I think that was a particular case. I mean, I think it's also where the light of the oxygen of publicity has really helped. I mean, I think if the Yazidis do end up getting some justice in the international courts, that will be because of journalists like you and people.
But the Yazidis feel angry because the Yazidis feel that, you know, these stories are really hard to tell, right? These incredibly awful ordeals, the most personal thing that they can tell, and yet they've told their stories and they thought something would happen as a result of it, and it hasn't. And so, you know, some of them are very angry, and I find it difficult to explain to them why, you know, they feel they've told their story and something should change. And I suppose I feel that too, so it's hard to explain. But I do think,
so when you go and you interview the Yazidis, I remember you went to that amazing place which sounded like something like out of a dark fairy tale in the middle of the fight in Germany, where a lot of the German government were keeping a lot of the Yazidi women who'd come across. And when you go to those places and you ask those women to tell their stories, do you say to them, and it's a real journalistic thing to say, is if you speak out, if you tell the truth, then there will be justice, or, you know, people will know? And is it a hard, almost feels like you've broken a covenant when you say to them, you tell me your story and I might be able to get you some justice, and then nothing happens?
No, I don't promise anything to people, because I'm afraid that for too many years I've seen that telling stories doesn't always change things. So, and I'm also very aware. But, you know, when I was doing the book, one of the girls I was talking to, a 16-year-old who, I mean, the most awful story, who had been taken by this fat ISIS judge, and then he one night brought back a 10-year-old, and this girl said that the worst night of her life was actually not him raping her, but her listening to him raping the 10-year-old in the next room as she cried for her mother. And these are really difficult stories to tell. And you know, we sat for a long time and she kept stopping, and I kept saying to her, "Are you sure you want to continue?" And she said, "Look, I don't want anyone to ever be able to say they didn't know." And you know, that's the best I can promise actually with this book. That's what I tried to do. I tried to tell as many stories from as many places on 4 continents to show that this is, in the 21st century, a huge issue that we're not doing anything about, and we should be. And it is outrageous that it is still going on at the scale that it is. And you can see why it is, because it's a very effective weapon. It doesn't cost anything. It's cheaper than a Kalashnikov bullet. And it's a way of humiliating people, of terrorizing people, of emptying villages. It's very effective, but it's not acceptable, and we should be doing something about it. And I do think that it's a shame there's not more coverage. And you were rare, actually, at the Sunday Times magazine in promoting that, because a lot of people are very resistant. They don't want to think about it, particularly male editors, I would say. And you and I know that some of the resistance, that they just think it, but just because something's uncomfortable doesn't mean that we shouldn't write about it or talk about it.
No, I agree. Do you want to talk, I mean, just because we've been talking about things which have seemed quite dark, there are some kind of lights in the darkness. I mean, I will never forget the amazing story of the Dr. Rape in the Congo, who's helped so many women. Do you want to tell us a slightly more optimistic story about when things get a bit better?
Actually, generally, people are surprised. I'm quite an optimistic person, even though I go to these bad places, because, like I was saying really a bit earlier, that you do come across people doing amazing things in really difficult situations. And maybe like here, we all sort of rallied behind Captain Tom Moore doing his walking, raising over £30 million. And, you know, things that people don't think that they would achieve, that they do. And so you really find that in difficult places. And the biggest privilege to me at my job is some of these people that I've met. And Dr. McCreggy is one of my greatest heroes. He runs this hospital in Bukavu in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is not democratic at all. And he he and his hospital have treated 55,000 women who have been raped. I mean, it's astonishing. And also terribly sad children as well. And the week that I was there reporting for you, a 6-month-old baby and a 4-year-old girl were brought in. I mean, and he really despairs, actually. And he won the Nobel Peace Prize 18 months ago, and which seemed like a really good signal that now there was focus on this issue. But he's quite disappointed. He says things haven't changed. And he said, you know, I didn't do this because I wanted applause and awards. I want people to take it seriously and to do something. And we know how difficult it is in this country to prosecute for rape. So imagine in a country like DRC, where the people who are perpetrating this are actually the people running the country or running the local area and have the guns, and that's very, very hard.
Do you want to explain a bit? I mean, because the reason why they're terrorizing the local population there is because there are some very, very valuable minerals in the ground.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite difficult to generalize on. War rape is, you know, very effective as a weapon in all the places from Bosnia, which lots of people heard about in the 90s, onwards. But it's, you know, often for different reasons. Sometimes it's for ethnic cleansing reasons. In the DRC, it is much more about that, as you said, about getting control of areas, because those areas have minerals in, and the kind of minerals that they have are things like things we need for our mobile phones and for our laptops. And so in a way, I mean, some people there say, you know, there is women's blood on our mobile phones.
I'm very aware that we've got some good questions coming in from some of the audience, and it's really fun for people to be allowed to ask their own questions. Jem, can you facilitate people being able to ask their questions?
I can. Yes.
Jane Wyatt, do you want to ask Christina? Because I think your question's really good about trauma.
2 seconds. That's on me. Let's see if this works. Hang on.
Sometimes it works. When it works, it's great.
I have clicked on mute, but it's not doing anything. I'm not sure if Jane has a microphone that works or not.
Okay, well, shall I do?
Yeah, do you want to read out?
So her question is, Christina, how do you cope with the trauma of war and disaster reporting? I know some colleagues who have PTSD, and I guess you must have managed to avoid it. What's your secret?
Well, I think partly it's what I've been saying, that I'm so inspired by the people that I meet there, that actually that kind of outweighs the horror of it. But I'm also very careful when I come back. In a way, I feel like I have a double life. You mentioned earlier about me being a mum, particularly when my son's now at university, so it's a bit different. But when he was younger, I would come back from being on a trip and, you know, immediately be sort of taking him to football practice and doing mum things, and or it shouldn't necessarily be mum things, but doing things that really kind of brought me back down to earth. So I wasn't sort of, as some of our male colleagues, hanging around in bars discussing like wars I have been through. It was much more family life. And also, I think not that many of my...
Do you think that helped? Do you think the kind of the normalization? I remember when you were under fire in Afghanistan, and you really, that was a really hairy moment. You talked about it.
I think it does. It's very grounding. You can't come back and sort of dwell on all the terrible things you've seen. But the hardest thing is coming back. You know, it's easy to keep going to these places and be jumping from one conflict to another. When you come back and have to think about it, and actually it can be very difficult to sort of be interested in things that actually do matter, but things like, you know, painting your bathroom or paying the mortgage, or when you've been in a place where people, every time they go out, they might not come back, it's very hard to really care about other things. It puts things in perspective, I guess. But I also, I mean, I have a lot of interests that are sort of outside. I really like theatre. I read a lot of novels. I travel a lot. A lot of my friends are not journalists, so I'm not talking about those kind of stories a lot of the time. So I try very hard to have a good balance. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think that's really true, because a lot of foreign correspondents end up kind of on the beat, don't they? They come back and a lot of them kind of drink, and then they kind of go off to the next one. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but that's definitely a trope.
Well, it is addictive, you know. I'm not going to lie. You know, that there is something about sort of surviving some near-death experience, and you get quite you can get quite high on that, and then want to do it more and more. But like I said, I've never been that interested in the fighting. I'm much more interested in people living in that situation. And oddly enough, the place that's been really hardest for me to deal with as a story is Zimbabwe. It's not the fighting in Syria or Afghanistan or Iraq or Libya. And that's really because of this whole feeling of wanting to tell people things that would affect change. And when you go to the same place over and over again, so I've been going there 25 years, and then reporting on all the terrible things that Mugabe was doing to people, the repression, and then now his successor, Mnangagwa, just a week or so ago, abducted 3 women, and they were tortured and apparently raped, and then they've been charged with creating public disorder instead of, I mean, the police should have been charged for what they did to them. And so when you see that and you pour your heart into trying to explain what's happening in these places and try and hope that people will do something to change things, and then it doesn't. And that I find really, really difficult. And it's harder now because you stay in contact with people much more than when I was starting out because of technology.
Yeah, so you used to say to us that you were getting kind of WhatsApps from people, refugees, say that you'd read and you'd met in Lesbos, or when you've been out kind of on the road. Is that, do you think there's much more of a sense that those stories kind of come home with you now?
Yeah, much more, because when I started out there was no mobile phone, which some people listening probably can't imagine, and no internet, and so the only way to send stories was through something called a telex, or you had to basically bribe an international telephone operator to make a call, and it was really laborious. It took, I mean, honestly, in my certainly first few years as a journalist, 90% of my job was logistics, and we used to take these like screwdrivers and things to take apart the plugs in telephone sockets to put our wires in, and so that was all really complicated. But also when you left a place, you couldn't, the only way to stay in touch with people then was to write them letters, which would have been a bit odd, right, really. So now everybody I meet pretty much is on WhatsApp or Telegram, and so they constantly message me, and that's really hard sometimes because you can't explain to them why things don't change. I just had recently with an issue with Afghanistan where they couldn't understand why it wasn't being covered here. And it's hard to explain, oh, well, everybody's so focused on coronavirus and actually they don't care about what's happening to you.
There are probably a few people on the call who don't know about that. I mean, this appalling attack on the maternity hospital in Afghanistan, which I have to confess I only found out about when I saw your tweet about it. So you're really worried that there are lots of stories that aren't being told at the moment.
Yeah, I understand that this is the most serious thing that's happened to us since the Second World War, and we obviously there's lots of things to cover, but the rest of the world hasn't stopped. There are still wars going on in Libya, in Syria, in Afghanistan, and there's also a lot of people taking advantage of the fact that there isn't much international attention. So a lot of kind of populist or repressive rulers who are locking up their opposition or silencing journalists because they know that no one's really going to do anything about it at the moment. So I feel it's really important that we still focus on those places. And the other thing too, from a more kind of self-interested point of view, is that, you know, coronavirus is a global pandemic, and we are not safe as long as anywhere else still has it, because it can be flown back. So, you know, we're only as strong basically as the weakest health system in the world. So it is in our interest to be helping other countries where it might spread. I mean, one of the interesting things, to my mind, we still know astonishingly little about coronavirus and how it spreads and why some countries it's been really bad and not others, even neighboring countries. So for example, Iran has been incredibly bad, and yet Iraq next to it has had very few deaths relatively. There are many examples.
And that's really true. That's not just because I think some of us assume that Iraq, they're just not doing any tests or anything, so people don't really know. But it's very true that there are less deaths there than in Iran.
Yeah, I mean, obviously some of the figures are probably a bit dubious, but if there were really huge numbers of deaths in some of these countries, we would know, because it's difficult now with social media to hide. You know, if the morgues are overflowing and things, it would come out. So it quite clearly, I mean, in Africa, it has been much less of a problem than we thought it would be, and nobody quite knows why, and that's good. But you know, maybe it's timing, and maybe there still will be more deaths. But yeah.
What the whole I really wanted to ask you about, and there's a question here from Lizzie Denning, talking about has the kind of field of work, kind of the field of correspondence, been getting smaller and more challenging recently? Do you think it's a relatively robust area of journalism, or do you think that lower print sales are having an impact?
No, well, that's sort of continuing on the same thing. I mean, first, the issue of us just being much more interested in ourselves, but secondly, that the kind of financial side, as we all know, newspapers are not doing very well at the moment. It was already very challenging with digital, but then now with coronavirus, advertising has collapsed, retail outlets have closed down, and so it's extremely difficult. It's very difficult for local newspapers even more. And so obviously the foreign side of it, newspaper, is the most expensive bit, sending us to all these places, and so it's a way of saving money. And so even before coronavirus, our coverage had been cut back a lot, sadly, and so sometimes I feel like I'm fighting a losing battle each week to try and get more foreign news in the paper and more interest in places.
And what would you say to somebody who wanted to become a foreign correspondent now? What's your top tip? So I know you must get asked it all the time.
No, I think, look, I mean, I've had an amazing time being a foreign correspondent. I have never been bored. I don't think many people could say that in their job. I've met all sorts of people. I have, like any journalist, I mean, it's great that you have an excuse to basically ask anyone about anything, which I'm a very curious person, so I like that. In terms of, you know, what is a useful skill, I think determination is the most important thing for a foreign correspondent, because you're trying to get into places where people don't want you most of the time and find things out that people don't want you to know. And I'm also a great believer in the sort of road not taken, which is the advantage of being a Sunday journalist, of not following where everyone else is going.
Oops.
Kind of story, and I think that is very useful as a foreign correspondent. But I don't think foreign corresponding is going to end, and in some ways I think that it's there's less foreign news in papers now than when I started, but in some ways it's easier to become a foreign correspondent because of what I was talking about earlier, the communications. When I started and I was freelancing, it would be really difficult for me to get through to a foreign editor, and then half the time they'd be at lunch, and then I couldn't email them, or there was nothing like that. So, and it was also incredibly expensive to make foreign calls, and so it was often really hard to get to the person that you wanted to offer a story. Now that has changed, but we're also seeing a lot more people reporting from their own countries, which is really good. But I do also think that there is a place for a foreign correspondent, that having a fresh eye, and also the fact that you're not in any way beholden. So somebody, living in Iran, for example, very difficult for them to report openly on what's happening in Iran, because otherwise they would get arrested and tortured and even worse, whereas somebody going in can come out and say things. They might never get a visa again.
Yeah, no, there are other kinds of problems. We've got some quite technical questions here. Somebody's saying, do you ever participate in a heat training, hostile environment awareness training?
Yeah. Yes. So these things are the bane of my life, because until the war in Iraq, I had never been on one of these, and I'd been covering conflict for a long time by then. And so I was a little bit annoyed, really, at the idea that I needed to be sent on a training course. And so I did it reluctantly, but we were all made to, because you couldn't get insurance unless you did one of these courses. That being said, I mean, some of it I think is incredibly useful, like the medical side of it. I always argue with them that they don't think enough about women correspondents. They don't talk about what to do in terms of sexual harassment and things. The last time I did one, they had a 1 hour segment after I'd argued with them a lot, in the whole of 4 days, 1 hour dedicated to women, where we were taught how to jab a pencil in someone's eye if they tried to attack us, which I'm not sure how. I've not actually tried to do this.
I mean, when you've been in situations, have there been situations where you felt kind of personally threatened, or had to? Do you ever carry a weapon or anything? Or
no, I don't think journalists should ever carry a weapon. But
weren't you told by the commanding officer in Afghanistan, weren't you asked if you could shoot straight?
Yeah, no, because we were in an ambush and Taliban had completely surrounded us, and he asked me he said, have you ever shot a pistol? Because he thought we were all going to be, which we were actually, down in these trenches, but he thought they would then try and take us captive, and we might prefer to actually shoot ourselves rather than be taken as a Taliban captive. Fortunately, it didn't get to that. And actually, oddly enough, when I was a kid, we used to go to fairs a lot, and I used to like shooting at things. So I'm quite a good shot, which impressed when I travelled with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, fighting the Russians when I first started out. And they used to just sort of laze around, sometimes just shooting at things. So they would ask me to fire at, not people, this was just targets. And so it was quite
a Kalashnikov?
Yeah, because often I was a better shot than them, and they were quite impressed, so that was handy. but I mean, going back to these hostile environment courses, I think they are very useful. I mean, my problem is I'd already done the job for so long the first time I went on it, and I think you kind of develop an antenna of knowing when things, and the idea of having somebody putting a sack over your head and pretending to kidnap you in a field in Berkshire when you actually have had somebody abduct you and in real life, I don't know, it's quite difficult. I probably wish I'd had training like that when I first started out, but it didn't exist then. So
it's probably a bit after the event, so it kind of sounds like it. What about somebody's asking about whether when you go to countries which have a very different attitude to women to the ones that we do, if you report from Saudi or those kind of places, is it more difficult when you're in a place where they have a very kind of non-Western view about what women should do, or are you kind of put in a special category?
Yeah. I mean, oddly, mostly in the Middle East, I think it's an advantage to be a woman because you can go and talk to all the women, whereas our male colleagues cannot speak to often, certainly can't go into sort of purdah quarters and things. And the women, after all, are half the society. So and maybe they're not running things in some of these places, but their views are very important. And so that, I think, is an advantage. I also think people find it easier to, it's like helicopters, listen to, so easier to talk to women. But of course, I have had problems, and sometimes it's very annoying. For example, in old days when I travelled more with a photographer who was invariably male, in places like Afghanistan, if I was with the photographer and I was saying to a person, or maybe a taxi driver who take this place, he would then ask the photographer, ignore me completely because I was a woman. Or even in interviews sometimes with Islamists, they would look at the photographer and not be listening to me ever. And I think that the only place I've ever gone to where I wanted to come back earlier than I was supposed to was Saudi Arabia, which I went to first just after 9/11, because 5 of the hijackers were from one particular area of Saudi Arabia. So I went in eastern Saudi Arabia and went to it, Abba, it was called. And it was so difficult to report as a woman. I mean, first of all, I had to have a letter from my husband saying that he gave me permission to go. And then everything was closed off. You know, I stayed in hotels where I was only allowed in a sort of family restaurant. I wasn't allowed in the business center. I wasn't allowed in the swimming pool. I wasn't allowed in the coffee bar. And yeah, it was very frustrating, actually. I mean, it has improved and now it's not as bad as it was, but that I did find really difficult.
It's a really interesting question here from Julia, saying that she covers Grenfell. She said she found she builds really different relationships with contacts because of the trauma that they've been through. And she says that have you found that hard as a journalist, that you're not their friend, despite the fact that you kind of check, you might check in with people that they're around, that because they've told you these stories, they then feel that you're a kind of friend or you have a different kind of relationship.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And also I think you feel responsible too, because they've trusted you and told you stories. And it is something I struggle with. And I mean, some people have become friends who I've known as a result of covering bad things that happen to them, particularly some of the women in Afghanistan. And there's nothing wrong with that, and that's good that we are friends, I think. But yeah, I mean, generally I think you do need to have some kind of distance, and I do think that that's harder because of what we were saying about WhatsApp and things, that you're too easy to contact.
Yeah. And do you, when you're preparing, because I must say our bodies, they're battlefields, there are so many such harrowing interviews, and I remember as your editor, I used to worry about the effect that hearing all of those stories had had on you, and the kind of toll that takes. Does that kind of play on you? I mean, what do you try and do or how do you prepare for those interviews, and then how do you also process what you've heard?
Yeah. I mean, I have realised in the last few years that often we as journalists are the very first people that really traumatised people speak to, because they, as they arrive, like the Rohingya arriving into Bangladesh, crossing the border, telling we were the first people that they told their stories, and we're not trained to deal with really traumatized people, and that's both difficult for them because we might inadvertently re-traumatize them in the way that we're asking the questions, and it's also difficult for us because of that. So I actually think that news organizations need to think about that much more, not just for people covering foreign events, but also for traumatic things. I mean, we mentioned Grenfell earlier here, because you can't expect people to just be listening to all these terrible stories and dealing with all that grief and you wouldn't be human if it didn't have some kind of toll on you. So I have actually been involved with a project with an American film director who reports on these things too, trying to kind of come up with some advice for how to interview traumatized people. So we've been working with survivors and talking to them about, and one of the things they say is how important it is for them to be able to tell the story in the way they want to, not the way you want them to, but so to be much more open-ended in their questions, not to be so specific, to give them a lot of time. That's of course not always easy. It's been easier for me working for a weekly paper or for writing books, but if you're on a deadline, trying to get someone to tell their story quickly of the most awful thing that's ever happened to them is really bad. And I think the other thing we need to be aware of is we can affect, if they do manage to try and go to court over these things, we can actually damage their court cases by, if we've reported anything inaccurately, or sometimes the same person is interviewed by a number of journalists and tells the story slightly differently each time. So a good example of that is Nadia Murad, the Yazidi woman who was the first Yazidi to really come out and tell her story. She now is kind of almost like the face of the Yazidi. She is a UN envoy. She shared the Nobel Peace Prize with Denis Mukwege, who I spoke about earlier. It would be almost impossible for her to get justice now for what happened to her, because she's done so many interviews, and it's very easy to find inconsistencies between those interviews. And I think she's an example too. One of the things that the people all said to me, the survivors, was, we don't want to just be our story. So it was very important to them that we didn't just report the awful thing that happened, but that also what they did before, or what their dreams were for the future. And so, and I think that in Nadia's case, she's kind of just become her story. And when you meet her, I found it quite disturbing, because I actually didn't want to talk to her about what had happened to her, because this was sometime afterwards. And yet I could sense she was just waiting for me to then ask, and then what happened when you were captured and raped, and that, it was very uncomfortable.
It's very uncomfortable, isn't it, that you're kind of, you want them to tell their story, and yet you're so aware how painful it is for them, and then yet that becomes, particularly the ones who then become well known, they tell it and retell it and retell it.
But this is just to go back, I mean, to the same with the coronavirus. That's why I think it's so important, these women saying, we don't want to just be our story, we don't want to just be the trauma, we want to be, people to know who we were before and what we would like to be in the future. And I think, again, the statistics, it was the same with the refugee crisis. People don't care when it's these big numbers, and it's up to us to try and bring out the stories. And one of the bus drivers who died of coronavirus, I interviewed his daughter, and she told me that he loved poetry and going for cream teas, and it was like the details like that. And she had a photo actually of him eating a cream tea, and so.
But that was always what was so brilliant about your foreign reporting, that you would tell us not just that this terrible thing had happened, but giving us a real sense of who these people had been and why they mattered. And I loved your bit that the sewing circles for a rat, about these people's interior lives, that they're not just people who got blown up. They were people with lives and dreams and hopes, and that's always what I think you're trying to do in the kind of stories that you tell kind of from abroad. I'm aware that we're coming to the end. There are two questions I wanted to get in. One saying, do you always use a local fixer? And is that always important? And does the translation affect the way you report and ensure accuracy? What do you do about the language thing?
Yeah, okay, so well, no, not always, because one of the things I've been lucky with is that I've gone back to the same places over and over again. So it was Afghanistan where I started, really, so I know people there. I don't always need to use a fixer. And Pakistan too, and actually in Pakistan it's quite difficult because there's been a lot of pressure on journalists there, and you can put them in danger by working with them. Also the same in Zimbabwe. So I worked in quite a few places where actually, although generally it's great to have a local fixer as local knowledge, I've worked in quite a few places where actually you're compromising those people too much by, I mean, in Zimbabwe, we were banned when I was going there a lot. And so you couldn't really work with anyone, because if you got caught, they would be imprisoned and it would be terrible.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And what about, there are two, what we're going to do is a quick fire kind of a last one. Have you ever refused, or would you refuse to go somewhere? That's from Louise. Not
yes,
in my experience, I would say. I've never had Christina say no. She's usually like, please send me here, please send me here.
Well, no, actually, so I have a good example of that with being a mum. So when the tsunami happened, so that happened, I think, on Boxing Day. And I'll never forget, my foreign editor at that time phoned me, and I was just going to a circus on Clapham Common with my little boy, and he said, oh, there's been this tsunami, and I think you should get on a plane. And I think it was Tuesday. So I said to him, well, do you think it will really still be a story by Sunday? I mean, because at that time it seemed like a small number. So he was like, well, I don't know, but I think we should go anyway. And so I didn't. I said, no, actually, I'm kind of like busy. I was supposed to be off that week, and so I didn't go. And then, of course, I was really annoyed I hadn't gone, and I was watching everything and driving my family mad, I think. And then, I mean, more recently, the job has become more dangerous. I mean, you and I lost a colleague, Marie Colvin, in Syria. And, you know, that really brought home the danger, and we have become targets in a way that we never were when I first became a correspondent. And so it was a time you felt like it was too dangerous to go some places. You know, Raqqa under ISIS control, you would have been mad to go there as a foreign correspondent, because you would probably have ended up on a video with a knife at your throat, which doesn't serve anybody. So yeah, there have been times where it has been too dangerous to go somewhere, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think years ago I would have found it very difficult to say no, it's too dangerous to go there. I hope that now there is much more recognition of things like PTSD, of the danger, and that people have more of a duty of care towards journalists. I think I felt, this is an interesting thing as a woman, because I felt certainly that I needed to be braver than the men. I needed to do that. I always felt as a woman there was this sort of question that you know, a woman in war wasn't going to be as brave, and so I felt that I needed to do more, and I think certainly Marie felt that, and others that I've spoken to, and that was wrong. We shouldn't have felt that.
Yeah, and do you think that could almost be manipulated, that because you were kind of women, or I think it was just there was a point where there was a very macho kind of feeling around foreign correspondence, wasn't there?
No, definitely it was manipulated, that you felt you couldn't say anything because otherwise then they would think, because she's a woman and she actually is scared to go here, and
But I think the very fact that it's spoken about now, that I mean that there are enough, you know, that you won so many prizes, and you know, your OB and all the rest of it for all the things that you've done. Do you think that in a way having all those kind of prizes and press awards and accolades behind you does mean that now if you if you have a kind of bad feeling about something, or you think it's too dangerous, you will say no in a way that you wouldn't have done 20 years ago.
But I don't think it should be anything to do with awards and things. I think you
No,
should be able,
I agree.
yeah, able to feel that. And I hope things have changed, actually. I don't think that, because there's been quite a lot of killings and beheadings and things of journalists. And I think, you know, people are much more aware now. And so, yeah, you know, and it's difficult. I mean, when I was starting out and you're very young, of course, you also think that you're indestructible and that nothing can happen to you. And the other thing that's difficult is that the most dangerous things that have ever happened to me mostly have been things that weren't supposed to be dangerous. So you can't always...
Well, like your famous trip to Afghanistan, which is meant to be, you know, there won't be a single gunshot fired, wasn't it? That was John Reed at the time.
But I think it's much more, who really takes the most risks are photographers and cameramen, or camera women, because they have to be, you know, right in the thick of the action. I don't need to be right, you know, where all the bullets are flying to be able to report on a conflict. So, yeah.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. As your friend. And last question, which I really like, is who's been your greatest inspiration in your job?
Oh my goodness.
And were you kind of Martha Gellhorn fan when you were kind of growing up, or what? I mean, what made you? What made you kind of think this was the thing?
Well, I didn't set out to be a journalist or a war correspondent. I wanted to be a novelist.
Which you are as well.
No, I've never written a novel. But then I, you know, went to Afghanistan, and the stories that people told me were just so astonishing. I thought, I can't make up stories like this, and I just became much more interested. I'm a huge believer in the sort of power of a story, and stories for a purpose, and trying to make people care about something through a person's story. So that's kind of what I've always tried to do. But yeah, I mean, I was absolutely obsessed by Hemingway and Martha Gellhorn, and also, you know, I actually wanted to work for the Sunday Times because they had, to me, the two best correspondents, which was John Swain and Marie Colvin, and I used to read what they wrote and wanted to do what they were doing. So.
Oh, okay, that's a nice tribute to Marie. We're going to stop there, but listen, everyone, I would really recommend that you buy Christina Lamb's Our Bodies, Their Battlefields. You can have lots more of these stories. It's not actually that good, and it's also very, as Christina says, in war zones, people are capable of doing amazing things. And I'm so proud to have worked with Christina for so long, and the amazing work that she's done on highlighting these stories. And what seems to be most appalling is that so many of these stories haven't been told properly before, and that there still aren't nearly enough kind of international cases where women get justice. And that this is still being, in 2020, it's still being used as a weapon of war, even though we're half the population. So I think we'll hear a lot more about this topic. And thanks so much, Christina, for coming on. We really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for listening. Now, I know Hilly wants to quickly jump in with to tell you about some of our events. Yeah, sorry, go on, Christina.
Yeah, because also just I've been posting these stories actually on Facebook, like inspirational stories about people that I've met in different places through the lockdown, just to sort of remind people of how people survive in these kind of situations. So, and these are stories mostly that they're people I've come across that I haven't written about in the paper. So if you have any time to have a look, it just sort of shows the different things that people are doing and the kind of stories that I care about.
No, they're really fun. Right, Hilly, have we got you there? Sorry, I can't.
Yeah, I'm here. Hello, thank you, Christina. Hello, thank you. Yeah, it was very inspiring. Thank you, and certainly very humbling. I think it puts worrying about face masks and hand sanitizer in perspective and the situation we're in now. Thank you very much. Just want to tell everybody about the next events we've come up which got coming up, which are great. We've got one, a very topical one next week, which is all about the effect that COVID and the lockdown is having on women and women's work, women at home, whether they're doing more of the domestic work, arguing with their partners, the whole economic impact on women of this whole thing, which for some people is very serious indeed. We've got a great panel lined up, so sign up for that soon. The following week, we've got Eleanor in conversation with Rula Khalaf, the newly appointed editor of the Financial Times, the first ever female editor there, so that's going to be really interesting. 23rd of June, we've got an event called How to Make a Fresh Start, which is all about if you're finding you're going to have to reinvent yourself a bit and diversify, whether you've dropped out of journalism for some reason a while ago, or finding, you know, the world is not the same for you as it has been, then please come to that. That's going to be very practical and full of top tips. And then for some real fun at the end of the month, we've got a Have I Got News for You style panel where the journos are going to take on the comedians, and that's going to be chaired by Joe Brand, which is very exciting, and we're going to be doing that in partnership with Funny Women. So please take a look at the website and sign up for all those things, and hope to see you there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming, all of you. Bye.